All right, we're back. I'm Casey Green. We're here at the ASU GSV Innovation Conference. I'm pleased to welcome Dan Greenstein, who is the Director of Postsecondary Success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Just a little bit of housekeeping once again. We're using the Shindig platform, and for our members of our live audience, you can submit questions either through the text box, and if you've got a webcam, we may even be able to bring you in live to pose a direct question to Dan over the air. All right, so with that, Dan, you've been with the Foundation for a couple of years. You effectively are the Senior Officer for Postsecondary Success. Foundation has a number of policy initiatives. It's got a number of programmatic initiatives. I'm going to be talking with some of your colleagues later on, but let's frame some of where the initiatives are right now programmatically for Postsecondary.
Yeah, great. And first of all, thanks for having me. This is
no,
great.
Thank you for joining us in
cool
the midst of a busy conference and lots of meetings.
It's very exciting. So I think that we're working in three areas. We began, so let me begin with a goal. We're working in three areas in order to improve post-secondary education in this country, focusing in particular on low-income first-generation students and students of color. Rationale, of course, is economic development. Right, 2025, the country needs 65% of the workforce to have a post-secondary credential. Today we're at about 40%. But there's also a very important equity component. You cannot get to those kinds of economic development numbers as workforce development numbers unless we do a lot better with our so-called new majority students. So our goals are really to help higher education improve so that it can credential more students, high quality credentials, affordably, reaching deeper and deeper into the population as we're going to need to in order to achieve these socially important goals. So we're working in three areas. One of them is historical, and it really focuses on, so I'm going to call them solutions. They are interventions or actions that appear to work to improve success, retention through to graduation of the students that we care about.
These are some of the pathway initiatives and others.
That's exactly right. And there's only 4 or 5. We've been working on them consistently. One of them is developmental education, remedial education reform. Seeing some progress there, actually, with the community. Another is online learning. A third is has to do with the technologies that support student advising. So working on solutions has been one of our hallmarks. I'm glad to say that we're seeing a lot of progress in the community in the areas that we've been working due to the community, I have to say, and our partners, not to us. The second really is looking at institutions which are using these solutions very effectively at enterprise scale in order substantially to improve their performance with the students that we care about. Georgia State being an example, having eliminated attainment gaps between black and white, between rich and poor. And then the third area is to figure out, so you're beginning to see coalescence around solutions that work. You're beginning to see some interesting evidence in these transformed places like Georgia State, Miami-Dade, and others. How do you actually get that knowledge into the community so that it is replicable with the same kinds of results? And so that's the third area, which really has to do with supporting adoption.
So let's talk about that. Earlier today, I had an opportunity. I was fortunate. We had Michael Crow, president of ASU. You know, he too is concerned about transferability and scalability. ASU's done some pretty amazing things in terms of growing enrollments, improving retention, completion, and big gains in research. Lots of places would like to do that. It's happened at ASU, and it also happened at ASU in the midst of big budget cuts. You've got a lot of pilot projects that are sort of carefully managed, carefully tendered. They get lots of nourishment, if you will. You know, the question is, how do you go to the next tier?
Yeah, great question. So, well, the first thing is that we've actually pulled away from pilot projects, except at the earliest.
But you started it.
Started with pilots, proof of concept,
some evidence,
build data, build evidence, but increasingly now only beginning to work with partners that are implementing these solutions at scale. ASU being a perfect example with respect to online, with respect to the technologies that support advising, Georgia State with respect to the technologies that support advising, emergency aid. You know, and what was interesting in making that transition is you make that transition from solution innovation and discovery to, you know, scaled enterprise implementations, which you really need to do to understand, you know, really what makes it work, what are the implementation paths, what are the costs and affordances. So there was some concern that there wouldn't be a lot of universities and colleges that were ready to move in that scaled sort of implementation approach. And frankly, it was one of the greatest delights and pleasures of my experience at the Foundation was to, in fact, find that almost overwhelmed by the number that are out there. And of course, it's driven by the concern with student success, but also the concern with the political and financial pressures that higher education is under.
One of the real challenges, you've been around higher ed for a long time as well as high, is the sustainability issue. You know, you get a lot of sunlight, a lot of nourishment, the excitement of a project. lots of people paying attention.
Yeah.
What happens in year 5 on a 4-year project?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, the people who are, the places that are making the most progress are the ones who realize that these student-centered, success-oriented initiatives aren't projects. They're actually critical to the success and viability of the institution. Student success is not only the right thing to do, it is also financially essential. And the institutions that recognize that at the leadership level and more deeply into the organization are beginning to understand that it's not just a project here and a project there that fit together in some odd and sometimes precarious ways, but they realize that this is part of an overall strategic objective to A, improve retention, and when you A, improve retention, you B, retain revenues that are otherwise lost.
Consistency, tenacity, leadership, but those are sometimes temporal things.
They are.
Somebody comes in, somebody, changes things. You think, again, at the risk of pandering, Michael Crow at ASU, what happens before and potentially what happens after. We see lots of presidents who are alleged to be transformative. Stuff gets sustained. It's like any other organization. New leadership comes in with a new agenda.
Yeah, and it's a question that we're going to see itself played out, because right now the current generation of highly transformational leaders are still in place on the whole. There have not been that many transitions, if you like. But it's interesting to look at a place like ASU or any of the others that I've mentioned. They're beginning to put in place the deep kind of infrastructure. Look, if you go to ASU or Georgia State or University of Central Florida or a handful of others,
Sinclair City College is doing some initiatives as well.
So if you go into places which have been at it for 5 and 7 and 10 years, and you speak to folks on the ground, faculty members, staff, relatively junior positions, not necessarily long duration at the institution, long tenure at the institution, they will speak in terms of the language of the leadership. And when that's beginning to happen, they will understand in a very visceral way, in a way that's localized to their particular function, what the university or the college is doing and why. And then you begin to think, wow, they've probably cracked it. They will sustain a leadership transition. You're also beginning to see a lot of infrastructure being put in place to support these retention initiatives, and that is also not easily undone. So I'm reasonably optimistic.
All right. We're 10 years after the Spellings Commission.
We are.
The mantra was affordability, accessibility, and accountability. A lot, from what you're saying, that there are institutions that are doing work with the foundation, or the scaling and transferring some of the stuff that was supported initially by the foundation, that are struggling, managing, perhaps even doing well on affordability, maybe accountability, accessibility. Others are not. How do we cross that chasm? Is it an issue of leadership? Affordability, we increasingly point to the public perception of affordability. The colleges are doing this to us, when in fact it's in many cases the state legislatures are doing it to you, in terms of the huge cuts in public funding for post-secondary education. Some institutions are making progress, and yet 10 years later there's a large numbers that still, those concerns are still with us.
I think one of the things we're finding in our institutional partnerships, and one of the reasons we're actually working with a broad group of institutions, to understand the various different enterprise models, or we call them educational enterprise models, that are being used to deliver affordable, quality education, which ensures that more students succeed. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there's probably 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or whatever, a finite number of clearly discernible, and I'm guessing and we're hoping replicable approaches which seem to work. So what's going to work at a place like City Colleges or a place like Miami-Dade is obviously unlikely to work at a place like Arizona State.
Context and culture are
Context
critical.
And culture, absolutely. And the student body that's being served. The
context and culture. Student demography.
Student demography. What's the sort of the mission of the institution? If you think of a Western Governors University, which is serving largely an adult population, which is returning to education with some credit and no degree. It's a very different kind of activity than a 4-year comprehensive institution, which is taking students directly out of high school by and large. So there's not any one-size-fits-all solution, but you're beginning to see models in each of these different institutional contexts that have more rather than less promise. And our work with the institutional partners is to try to lift up those things which look successful, and then to make them available to others so they can be replicated.
We've been talking for the last 10 minutes about what the foundation is doing now and where it's going. I want to take a moment and say, let's look back. This was a journey of discovery. This did not emerge fully formed on a whiteboard someplace in Seattle and say, okay, we got the perfect plan. Let's get a couple of pilots. It's easy. It's hard. It's difficult. There's a lot of discovery. There's a lot of trial and error. if you would, take a moment or two to talk about sort of the learning experience of that trial and error that got to the present and what the future looks like in terms of these initiatives.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that not unreasonably, when the strategy was launched in 2008,
Yeah.
it did. With the goals have always been very.
The goals have
same.
been
The goals
very
have not
consistent.
spread.
Yeah.
And so there's a period of three,
But
maybe.
there's a cup to lip experience.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a period of 3, maybe even 4 years, very deliberately of experimentation. If the goal is to improve student outcomes for a particular particular body of students,
Yeah.
low-income first-gen students, students of color. What are the best leverage points? Where should we begin? And we operated very, very broadly and appropriately, learning as we went, and a lot of pilots in a lot of areas, and using those exploratory investments to identify areas that were more rather than less promising. That enabled us really 3.5 or so years ago to focus down on the strategy that we now have, working in a handful of areas that appear from all the evidence to have an enormous amount of potential and impact, to recognize that it's not the particular solutions that are really the secret sauce, but the way they're integrated into an enterprise, a college or a university. And so that moved to the institutional partnership. And then how do we actually help to create an enabling environment, and that sort of references the policy work that I haven't spoken about, that enables those things to emerge, to have the relevant levels of documentation and support so they can be adopted and replicated by others. And so that path from exploration to analysis and focus to really moving in towards execution. It's retrospectively, of course, it was a seamless journey, and it, of course, has had some very many interesting avenues that have been pursued.
Let's talk about policy first. Foundation recently issued a major report about the data side of public policy. We're collecting a lot of data, we amass the stuff, but a lot of it is just not useful in terms of addressing the issues that need to be addressed about learning outcomes, institutional performance, and accountability. Where do you expect that to go? I mean, the paper provided a roadmap, and it provided a roadmap across a lot of different agencies and organizations at the federal and the state level and the institutional level about the elements we need and the kinds of the tools that we should be providing, and the data that should be very public, very transparent, and changing the culture of data from data being a weapon to a resource. That's been out now for 2 months. You're getting a lot of public comment. You're getting some private comment about that as well. 3 years from now, how do you judge the success of that?
Gosh, so I would so in a number of ways. So first of all, we're seeing more and more institutions using that kind of data framework in order to capture their own data for their own various purposes, without understanding the nature of our colleges and universities. We cannot evaluate our performance, and we cannot, for our own purposes as higher education leaders, we have a responsibility to the students and often to the taxpayers who are helping to support our efforts, an obligation to understand, not as a weapon, as you say, but as a tool in order for continuous improvement. So we're seeing that broader scaled adoption at the institution level. We're also beginning to see recognition at the regional, but also the state level, that having consistent data that integrate across the education pipeline creates enormous opportunities to improve that pipeline. So, and frankly, and I've said this publicly, and I would continue to say it, that unless we understand those pathways through the aggregate student record, we're basically guessing at policy and pathway implementation.
Well, we're doing what we've always done, epiphany and opinion as opposed to evidence.
And so where we've seen these data resources assembled, they begin to drive enormously exciting and potentially very impactful conversations, because it begins to provide a platform where you can assess different opinions against the data.
Are they exciting enough to push back the concerns about privacy and the intrusive role of that data collection?
So I've never seen data collections which encroach on privacy. They're all at the
But that's always the fear. That's the kind of standing in the doorway. We can't let these agencies get these kinds of data. It's intrusive. It's security.
The agencies that have the data are the schools and the colleges.
I understand that, but it's still the record stuff that somebody will see my stuff. Is sort of the ultimate example of the argument with the pushback.
Totally understand this. Totally understand the fear. I also understand the security regimes and the.
I want to close with 2 questions about public policy. So at least on the Democratic side, less so on the Republican side. there's been this ongoing conversation, you could say some of it's policy, some of it's posturing between tuition-free college and debt-free college.
Yep.
Does that advance anything at all, or is that just sort of off here on the side, and that's really a sidebar because a lot of the concern and angst and anger about affordability and kids with large debt?
Yeah, look, as far as I'm concerned, and I think it's having higher education as an issue being discussed and debated in the public domain is super important. It is focusing attention on challenges which are real and vital to the nation's continued progress, both as a civil society and also as its economic success. So I think all that's good. Our focus at the foundation is ruthlessly on student success.
Okay. Bill Gates will be here this evening. He posted on LinkedIn earlier this week about America's secret weapon is innovation. He doesn't hesitate to use the bully pulpit, sometimes successfully, sometimes perhaps not as successfully, to argue for a lot of things. You two have a bully pulpit, may not be quite as elevated as his. Again, going back, the election conversation about education, both K-12 and higher ed, has been a lot of posturing and a lot less policy. As we go into the kind of the rundown to into the conventions and beyond, what are the three things that the candidates really need to address on policy, regardless of party affiliation?
Yeah, I would never propose to advise the candidates, but I'm comfortable in my role working with.
I'm not suggesting you advise. I'm saying, at the top of your voice in the biggest possible fonts, attention must be paid.
So at the top of my voice in the biggest possible fonts, directed at higher education leaders, our focus is consistently on identify solutions that work, build an evidence base around them, understand that evidence base, use that evidence base to understand implementation paths that work for the institution in which you happen to be located, and then have robust, honest, and open conversations within the institution, with the institution stakeholders that are data-driven about paths forward that improve the lot of the students that particular institution serves.
Dan, thanks very much for joining us. It was a fast-paced conversation. We covered a lot of territory. I think we did it well.
Thank you very much.
Much appreciated your time today. Folks, we will be right back. Stay with us.